Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program, Infrastructure from Allocation to Implementation. Last November, President Biden signed into law a $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill. This afternoon, we will talk about how that money is being spent. How do we build next-generation infrastructure, and what technology will be at the forefront of this transition? And what will our future look like when we live in a world that is modern, connected, and eco-friendly? Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Schneider Electric and the Project Management Institute, for supporting today's conversations. A few housekeeping notes before we begin the show. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill Infrastructure. We also broadcasting live. We'll be taking your questions throughout the program. Our first guest is Mitch Landrieu, former New Orleans mayor, and now the White House senior advisor responsible for coordinating the implementation of the infrastructure law. Mitch Landrieu, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
I first want to talk about, we all know that the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed last year, and you've got the big job of implementing this massive law. Where are we, and how long will it take? Because this is a big bill that has, I'm sure, a long timeline, both short and long term.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm loving what I'm doing. We're basically doing three things. We're building a team, we're getting the money out of the door, and we're telling the story to the American people so they can see the fruits of what their investments are. So as you said, you know, when legislators pass bills, they think that's the end of the road, when in fact it's just the beginning, because you have to actually get the money out of the door and build the things that the legislation was intended to build. So this is the most transformational investment in our nation's infrastructure in the last 60 or 70 years, and arguably in the history of the country. A lot of money to rebuild roads and bridges and airports and ports and waterways, high-speed internet for everybody in America, and to build a clean energy economy. And so one of my jobs is to coordinate all the federal agencies and get them working together, to work with all the governors and get them to appoint an infrastructure coordinator so that we can coordinate federal, state, and local government, and also to talk to all the hundreds of mayors in America so we can be a one team, one fight mission. And that's what we've done. And in the past 10 months, we've hit the ground running. We've pushed $110 billion out of the door. We have 5,000 projects coming out of the ground as we speak. And of course, we have some immediate term things that we're doing, but mostly this is an investment in the long-term stability of America. So these are 3, 5, 7-year projects, some of which will be huge and transformational. Others will be thousands of incremental projects that, when added together, will be transformational as well.
As you know, there were critics of the legislation, even though it was bipartisan, but many Republicans said it's going to hurt the economy, it's going to hurt jobs, and certainly going to hurt inflation. What's your response to that? What is the impact on jobs and the economy from this legislation?
Well, a couple of things just to get straight. 14 Republicans did vote for it. The rest of them voted against it. Secondly, I haven't met somebody that voted against the bill that didn't want the dough. As they like to say, they voted no and they want the dough. The president's mission is to get the money down to the ground everywhere in America, whether their legislators and congressmen voted for it or voted against it. Secondly, they were wrong about it increasing inflation. It didn't increase inflation. It's going to help decrease inflation, because much of the investments are in producing infrastructure investments where we can get the supply chain moving faster. They were also wrong about jobs. In the last year and a half, the president has created 10 million jobs, more jobs than any president in the history of the country during the first term of his office. And he's created over 600,000 manufacturing jobs. The country's in a manufacturing boom. So this has been a win-win-win. Those folks that voted against this bill, I predict, will regret it. But at the same time, they're going to make sure that the money gets down to the ground. And, you know, as politicians will do, they'll try to take credit for it, which is fine, too. The point is to make sure that every American citizen has access to better roads so we can get places faster, right? Better bridges, because it connects us. Clean water, which we're seeing the results of this across the country as we speak. In Jackson, we're seeing it in Flint. A lot of our kids have been poisoned with lead in their water, and it's going to help with their health. And building a clean energy economy, which, by the way, has spurred billions of dollars of investment from the private sector, with billions of dollars of announcements coming from GM and Ford and other companies that are creating high-paying jobs across America. So this is going to be a win-win-win for the country. It's $1.2 trillion, but the truth of the matter is it's not enough to do everything, but it's enough for the country to get a great start of becoming #1 again in manufacturing in the world. And that's what we're going to do.
Now, Mitch, you've been a leader at the local level, mayor of New Orleans, as well as lieutenant governor of Louisiana. How has that experience helped you coming to D.C. to say this is how it's got to be done? Because you've obviously in Louisiana, you've dealt with a lot of issues, climate change related. What have you brought to the table that maybe some of the D.C. insiders like me would not know?
Well, look, I'm not of D.C. I love D.C. and it's a wonderful place to be, but I'm a local government guy. And being from the ground and then coming to D.C. is like going to Mars sometimes, because we speak a certain language up here that doesn't always translate to the ground. Sometimes we talk in acronyms that nobody understands, and we can't say something that's complicated in a really simple way. People on the ground just want things to happen. If you can't find a way, they want you to make one. Instead of saying broadband, they want you to say high-speed internet, because that's what they understand. When you're trying to build a road or a bridge, they want you to understand that there's a firehouse across the street, or there's a combine that you're trying to get across. So somebody that's working in agriculture can get from one side of the creek to the next. Just real personal stories about finding people where they are. So, for example, the other day I was in Lowndes County. I was at a woman's house who didn't have plumbing in her house, and just trying to translate that to the people of America. When you say I'm going to fix the water systems, actually makes sense. If you're talking about building high-speed rail or fixing Amtrak, the other day I met a gentleman who's a third-generation worker of Amtrak. We had the dignity of that work. He was able to put his family, through school. His daddy was a worker. His son is a worker. You begin to understand then the idea that the president says, I'm going to use this money to rebuild the country and bring people back together, to put them to work, so that we can then be the masters of our own destiny in America. And you just got to be real simple and straightforward about it. Get the money out of the ground. Tell the people where you're spending it so they can see it. And hopefully we'll do more of it, because the country needs it if we're going to compete the way we say we want to compete and win the 21st century, like the president says that we should.
Yeah, no, it reminds me when I covered the Labor Department, and the government term was egress, and they just said, let's call it an exit, because people get that. And that kind of, let's avoid the acronyms, because that people don't understand acronyms, certainly outside of D.C. But as far as when this is going to change lives, when I mean, there has to be a certain amount of patience because of the implementation of this. I know there have been some, short term, but when do people see, oh, okay, this is affecting my bridge. This is affecting
to a certain extent, it's happening. You're right that there is some long-term stuff here. I mean, when you go rebuild something like a major bridge across a major waterway like the Mississippi River or in the Ohio Valley, it takes time to build that bridge. But as we speak, there are 5,000 projects coming out of the ground all across America in all of the areas that I talked about. The other day, I was in Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., sitting outside of a citizen's house where we watched construction workers changing the piping that takes water in and out of the house to get rid of the lead paint. I did the same thing in Ohio. As I said, I was in Lowndes County, and we were changing out a sewage system in a citizen's house. I was in, today is Tuesday. Yesterday, on Monday, I was in Boston with the president announcing a $65 million investment to rebuild the Logan International Airport. So all of these projects that are going around that are actually causing you a little frustration because maybe it's backing up traffic because there's so much construction going on are all part of the infrastructure bill that we talked about.
Mitch, how do you make sure that there's equity in the distribution of the money? Because obviously, the lobbying world and lobbyists, all these communities want to get their chunk. But how do you make sure that communities of color are getting what they need?
Well, it's an excellent question. Well, the two ways that this money is getting to the ground. One of them is through traditional formulas that go straight to the governors. So the legislatures and the governors and the city councils have to go argue about how they're going to spend that money. But we have regulations around how that money can be spent, and we'll watch that. There's a second way that it gets to the ground, and these are competitive grants. And the secretaries of the departments get to choose who gets them and who doesn't. And this is an open book test. Those applications for grants that think about equity, making sure that everybody is included, making sure that we're focused on neighborhoods that have been left behind, making sure that we have high-paying jobs, making sure that we're thinking about climate. Those are the ones that are going to get a yes from the federal government rather than no. And then thirdly, some of it's actually designed into the bill. For example, everybody knows the story of how the highway system in this country cut African-American neighborhoods and indigenous communities right in half and separated them from each other. We have $1 billion in this bill that are designed to actually reconnect those neighborhoods. And there are numbers of different projects that are ongoing as we speak that are actually doing that. I just came back from Denver, Colorado, and they actually took a main highway and they actually dug a canal underneath it, a tunnel underneath it, and they flattened out and connected the highway. And the two communities that were on both sides of it have now been reconnected with community opportunities. There's a soccer stadium, there's an amphitheater there. There are other things. So now the school and the businesses from one side to the other are connected. We're doing that all over the country. And some of the programs are designed with that intent in mind.
Last question. How do you coordinate? There's so many government agencies that have a piece of this bill, obviously transportation, but there's climate change, electric vehicles. Are these agencies talking to one another on a daily basis to implement this law?
Well, that's my first job. So I'm the head of a task force, and in that task force, we have 14 cabinet agencies that report together to me and Brian Deese, who's the head of the President's National Economic Council. And we have met now 13 times for the purpose of coordinating our activities. So, for example, Secretary Buttigieg, who's at the Department of Transportation, and Secretary Granholm of the Department of Energy are responsible for making sure that we deploy 500,000 electrical vehicle charging stations across the country. So they've created a joint office. We have EPA, who's supposed to be working with the Department of Interior, Agriculture, who's supposed to be working with the FCC. One of my responsibilities is to make sure that we're talking, we're coordinating, we're a one-stop, one-shop, team, so that we speak with one voice. And then it's my job to actually coordinate with the governors and keep those guys and gals in the loop, along with all of the mayors and all of the leaders of all the indigenous communities. And we work on that every day to make sure that we get the execution right, because you've got to get the money out. You got to get it into the ground so that people can see the results of it. And we're doing that as we speak.
I tell you, there are a lot of skeptics that didn't think it was going to pass. I was among them, but it did pass. And Mitch Landrieu, now you have to implement this law, one of the most important jobs in Washington, without a doubt. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Now joining me in studio is Kate Gallego, the mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. Mayor Gallego has ideas on how to make Phoenix the most sustainable desert city and how infrastructure money can help achieve that goal. Welcome, and thanks for joining us in studio.
It's good to be with you.
It's great to talk to a live person in studio. Well, what are the infrastructure priorities for Phoenix, and how does the bill, now law, help your city?
We are the fastest growing city in the United States, 5th largest city, and we're doing that in a desert environment where we have to make sure we have a sustainable water supply. We also really think a lot about our transportation system, and being Phoenix, we want to make sure Phoenix does not need to get any hotter than it already is, right, so that we're managing our greenhouse gas emissions. We're making a big push on electric vehicles, which we think is a technology that makes sense for us from an air quality perspective, as well as we have a great concentration of EV companies in the greater Phoenix area. We've been dubbed the Electric Valley because of all of those companies coming together. So invite you to come out. We're hosting a football game in the greater Phoenix area this February. Will be the first Super Bowl where you can...
I was going to ask you about that.
You can go from the NFL honors party to the free concert to the fan zone in an autonomous electric vehicle.
Yeah, no, it doesn't, after week one, it doesn't look like my New York Jets will be there in February. Cardinals had a rough game as well, but they have a better, I think, shot to be there. But on the heat, you mentioned heat. How much of that is such a challenge? And tell me about cool pavements. I have never heard about this until I looked at the research our team put together.
We are the first city in the country to create an Office of Heat Response and Mitigation that's a permanent part of government and looks at the entire city. How can we think smart about heat? One of the programs they work on is a cool pavement program where we put a lighter colored coating on the streets. It's reflective, and it's the same sort of idea. You don't wear a black t-shirt when you're going out somewhere that's hot.
Right.
The pavement had been holding in the heat, including overnight. We now have data from Arizona State saying it is 10 to 12 degrees cooler, so it's a difference
10 to 12 degrees
that you can feel.
Okay.
And it doesn't have costs that are hard for anybody. It just makes it a more comfortable community. It does look a little bit grayer, so we get questions from some residents why the streets change color.
Right.
But overwhelmingly, we get more residents saying, when you come into my neighborhood, I want my kids to be out biking on a more comfortable city street.
That's pretty great idea. You mentioned the Super Bowl. What are the infrastructure needs for such a big event that's upcoming in February?
Well, we will be powering it with clean renewable energy, which makes sense. We're the one of the sunniest regions in the country, and so to take advantage of the great sun is important. It's a huge transportation challenge. It will be the busiest day at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. It'll also be the busiest day for our transit system. Part of the reason that many of the events involving the Super Bowl are in downtown Phoenix is we have the most built out transportation system, and with the light rail you can move in a lot more people. It is funny though, we are trying to expand the system, and we've told our construction partners all of the construction in downtown must be done before the Super Bowl parties come to town. We want to take advantage of that.
The infrastructure law, talking to a number of experts today, and obviously various communities want to get their piece of the pie. How much is going to be coming to Phoenix, Arizona from the bipartisan infrastructure law?
We are going to see a great partnership to modernize our airport, including making it faster once you get in the plane to get into the air, which we know no one wants to be sitting waiting on the tarmac.
Right.
Secretary Buttigieg was just in Phoenix to announce we're getting a major riverfront redevelopment grant. Phoenix exists where we do because of the Salt River. We were a farming community, but we've sort of turned our back on that, and with the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, we'll have a great chance to really reinvigorate that. It was actually a dream of Senator John McCain that he talked to President Biden about when they were in previous jobs, and it's neat to see us moving forward with the federal partnership in that area. We also got a great grant to help our bus system go towards low emissions, which helps us with the electric valley vision, as well as maybe looking at hydrogen as a possible solution.
You mentioned earlier electric vehicles. What are some of the goals for Phoenix? There are federal goals of obviously using more EVs and eventually phasing out gas-powered cars. Well, what is the vision you have for Phoenix?
We have a citywide electric vehicle strategy passed unanimously, and we have a very diverse council philosophically.
Passed
so
unanimously?
It was bipartisan.
Wow. Okay.
Always good news.
Yeah.
EVs has been one of the areas where in Arizona we've come together across party lines, and part of that is just it's such a large industry for us. We are looking at 280,000 vehicles in just Phoenix by 2030, which is huge investments to be able to get there. We're mapping out our city and trying to figure out where we can put in public charging. Libraries and parks have been particularly popular, although the zoo has the most popular charging station because they have this whole rhino charging thing that's very clever, and people can charge while they go in and see the great animals.
Wow, that's great. That's great. As far as prioritizing, life is about prioritizing. How does your city prioritize what it needs and what could wait? How do you do that?
The administration has been great about reaching out, Mitch Landrieu himself, and asking what is most important to you. We have looked at what are our biggest economic engines. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport is one of the 10 busiest airports for takeoffs and landings in the world, so continuing to invest in that was incredibly important to the economic well-being of our region. We, like many cities that are in a river valley, have real air quality challenges. The air gets trapped, and vehicles emissions is another big area where we have opportunity for improvement, and that's part of the reason we're putting such a push on clean vehicles. But also, again, it helps us move towards the industries of the future. And then we're a desert community, so water supply always has to be at the top of the list. We are one of the many communities that depend on the Colorado River, which is severely overallocated, and so the money in both the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act for drought is important to us.
We've been doing a series at the Hill called Dried Up and highlighting the water shortages. How bad is it in Phoenix right now?
So we do have a 100-year water supply, but we're trying to hopefully invest in water reuse and other technologies, and we're having fun as we do it. So we're trying to get people exposure to that technology. We did a microbrewing challenge where all the breweries in Phoenix created beer with reclaimed water and had a lot of fun with that.
I bet that was popular, yeah.
As an elected official, I felt like I had to participate on behalf of my community. I was doing some global climate change work and came in front of then Prince Charles, now King Charles, and was telling about what we're doing in Phoenix around climate change. And he really zeroed in on the reclaimed water beer challenge. So it was sort of those surreal moments where my staff was like, I can't believe the mayor's talking to Prince Charles about reclaimed water beer. But he was deeply interested. Do you think I should send him a coronation gift?
I think that would be nice. I think that would be very nice. As far as, we're in a weird time economically. We're still in a pandemic, 2.5 years in, and it's led to kind of an uneven economy where there are some good signs and bad signs. And the labor, there's a rail strike issue that we'll be talking about. But as far as labor shortages, how has that been? It's affected every industry, including journalism, where it's harder to find talent. What's the labor issues going on in Arizona right now? Is it hard to find talented people, and how do you do it?
Phoenix is the fastest growing city in the country, so we've had a lot of people moving into our market and chasing higher wage jobs. We've done a big push in the semiconductor industry, and we've had to partner with our community colleges to make sure we had folks ready to fill those jobs, which seems to be going well. But then we've had other issues like lifeguards shortage was an issue for us at the city of Phoenix. We couldn't find as many people who wanted to be lifeguards, which I feel like when I was in high school, those were the cool kids, the summer lifeguards.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I saw a sign of recently in my Virginia neighborhood of lifeguards wanted experience preferred, and if I'm at a pool, I'd prefer the experience of a lifeguard instead of an inexperienced one. You deal with D.C., you're in D.C. this week. How is it? Take us behind the scenes of the coordination that mayors have with the White House and maybe Congress and other people in D.C.
We work very closely with the White House and the cabinet agencies. There's several groups like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, climate mayors that all come together and try to make sure mayors understand what's in these very large pieces of legislation and how to apply. It's really felt like this is an administration that values mayors. There are so many mayors in leadership positions, including the cabinet and the position that Mayor Landrieu has. I was actually in a conversation with some deputy mayors in London. We were trying to help them understand how we are responding to heat. And I had such a laundry list of things that the federal government was partnering with us, and they were quite jealous because their national government doesn't have as many tools for cities as we do. And that's been really wonderful. We'll bring a problem to them and they look for solutions.
Has the communication been better in the Biden administration than in the Trump administration? Now, obviously, the law just passed, to be fair to the Trump administration, but was there constant communication or not as much in the Trump administration with mayors in your experience?
We had a real challenge with the Trump administration. We would have issues like we had facilities for migrants in our community and they didn't tell us, and then we'd find out when there was like a 911 call to the police department that they were looking for someone, which was just a hard way to find out. In some ways, the Biden administration communicates so often that you have 3 opportunities a week to get in a conversation with them, and we're trying to figure out which ones we take because I don't want to say over communicate, but there is always an opportunity to jump on a Zoom and get an update from the White House, which is very refreshing. And it's just been nice. Every time I come to DC and present a problem, we learn about a new solution. So that's refreshing. Okay.
Well, Mayor Gallego, thank you so much. And really appreciate you coming in studio and spending some time with us.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me back.
Our next guest is Congressman Sam Graves, ranking member of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee and a Republican from Missouri. Congressman, thanks for being with us. I think you might be muted, or I can't hear you. If you can unmute.
I'm not muted.
Oh, I can hear you now. Now I can hear you. Great. Let me start with some news of the day, Congressman, on the rail strike. What are your thoughts of it generally, and do you think that Congress should get involved before this Friday deadline? It is the #1 issue in transportation this week.
Well, if Congress gets involved, that'll obviously avoid a strike. If we have a strike, it's going to, have a devastating impact all over the country, and it's going to just stop up the entire supply chain. So we need to do everything we can to avoid a strike. I would like to see all parties accept the resolution, the recommendations. That would be the best avenue forward. Unfortunately, I think that Speaker Pelosi is going to punt this thing down the road, and she's going to, try to, extend the cooling off period till after the election, which would be the most devastating thing ever, because that means everybody starts from square one. It all starts all over again, and all of those original agreements are going to are going to go away. They're going to tear them up and start all over.
Congressman, on transportation, this used to be more, and you've been working on this for years, it used to be more of a bipartisan issue. The infrastructure bill just had over a dozen Republicans in the House vote for it. Why has this become more of a partisan issue, and what were your main concerns with the infrastructure now law?
Well, the biggest concern is the fact that it's not paid for. I mean, we completely went outside what the original premise was, and that is the highway bill. We were trying to stay within, we've always tried to stay within those guardrails, and that is the money that's provided for highway construction, highway and bridge construction coming from the gas tax or from the highway trust fund. We walked completely away from that, and there was no pay fors. And it turned into an extraordinarily partisan process. And by doing that, then ultimately the House was completely blocked out of it, and the Senate bill was just accepted. We could have passed something that could have competed with the Senate bill, come together in conference and come up with a much, much better bill. But for whatever reason, the Democrats have decided to go completely partisan. And the Transportation Committee has always traditionally been a very bipartisan committee, and it's unfortunate that that we've seen this turn.
As far as the record inflation, do you blame the infrastructure law as well as the IRA legislation that was just signed into law?
Listen, that you don't fix inflation by spending money. That's not how you do it. You don't put more cash out there. All that does is make inflation a lot worse. And unfortunately, the administration and the leadership on the majority side right now, they want to pretend that this isn't happening, but it's having real world impacts on folks. Families are going to have to spend $6,000 more per year, just due to inflation. And you look what's happening with construction costs. We're seeing it's a lot worse than the 8.3 that families are having to deal with. In construction, you're seeing over 12% for just general construction costs. And if you look at specifically for materials for highways and bridges, it's over 15%. And what that's doing is it's cutting back now. You're seeing, organizations, whether that be municipalities, counties, states, they're cutting back on the projects that they originally were trying to do just because of the inflation factor.
As far as you know, we've got a midterm election upcoming, and most independent political handicappers think you, and I am among them, that you will win back the House. What would be, if that happens, what would be your transportation priorities?
Well, we've got two or three. First of all, we're going to have to provide oversight on the money that's going out with the infrastructure bill. It's the law of the land now. And when you're pushing, $1.2 trillion out the door, there's a potential for waste and fraud and abuse. And so we're going to provide oversight. We're also going to make sure that the letter of the law is followed, that the bill provided for one federal decision to streamline projects into 2-year approval process. We want to make sure that is followed. We also want to make sure that states have the flexibility to be able to add lanes, add capacity. The administration has put out, a directive to the states that discouraging them from adding new lanes, which is unfortunate. And we've also got the FAA reauthorization that's coming right behind it. We've got to get that done next year, and very important bill, something that we're going to be starting to work on right after the first of the year, and then of course after that we'll have WRDA and some of the other reauthorizations that we have to do.
Based upon the political climate, are you confident you're going to win back the House?
I never count my chickens before they hatch. And so I'm just going to get through the election and hope everybody gets through the election. And I'm cautiously optimistic, but you never know. You never know. And what do we have, 6 weeks to the election? It's an eternity in politics. So you just never know what's going to happen.
Your home state is getting, I believe, close to $12 million from the infrastructure. What are the needs of Missouri? Where should that money be spent? What are the biggest concerns right now at the local level?
Well, the legislature is doing a very good job, and Governor Parson has done a very good job of figuring out how to move forward with infrastructure projects and get them paid for. This was ahead of the infrastructure bill. So we're seeing some real good work being done by Missouri. In fact, just to give you a specific, they're moving $100 million to rural roads, what we call lettered routes in Missouri, which are very important to our rural constituents, and they're just literally falling apart. And as a result of some federal dollars coming in, we've been able to supplant dollars, and that opened up money for these rural roads. So that's a great example. They're going to continue to do a good job of divvying up that money, but increased capacity is a big part of it. We are bogged down on I-70 with the amount of traffic that runs through the state of Missouri. So I know they're looking at doing that. As another, we've got a couple of bridge projects we're continuing to work on in both Kansas City and in across the Missouri River by Columbia, Missouri. So a lot of work that's out there that they're working through that process, but we want to make sure the money is spent on traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges.
As far as your relationship with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, I've talked to a lot of ranking members over the years, especially when they're dealing with an administration that's not in their party, and they have a difficult time getting some cabinet secretaries to respond when they're ranking member, less so when they're chairman. Is your relationship with the secretary pretty good? He's been pretty responsive to you, or no?
Yeah, he has. And I got to say, he's been very responsive. We had lunch together. I guess it was just before we left for August break, and he has been very accessible. He's called me on a couple of occasions to ask my opinion. So he's been good. The administration hasn't been so good. They called for bipartisanship and talked a good game, but nothing came from it. But I have to say, Secretary Buttigieg has been very accessible. He's a nice individual, pleasant individual to visit with. So I can't say anything bad about his accessibility, at least to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think? Last question. Do you think that the Biden White House will pivot? Mitch McConnell has said that Biden will become more moderate if the House and/or Senate flip. Do you agree with that?
It's tough to say, and I got to say, President Biden is not the same Joe Biden that used to serve in the Senate. This is a extraordinarily partisan individual. Again, he talks a great game. He brought us all in when we started the infrastructure process. He brought us all in and wanted our ideas, sat there and listened to us, and then literally just walked away from the table and said, we can't work with Republicans. And then, of course, the House followed suit right behind that. So here's an individual that has gone extremely partisan, and I suppose if he's trying to salvage a little bit from his administration, if Republicans do take over, he might go down that road. But I think he's being pressured pretty hard by the extreme far left, and he's walking right into that trap, and it's hurting him. It's hurting his record. It's hurting the administration, and the country's suffering for it.
Congressman, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Absolutely.
And now for the sponsor perspective session of the program. We are joined by Kevin Self, Senior Vice President of Strategy, Business Development, and Government Relations at Schneider Electric, in conversation with Jason Jedlinski, Publisher and General Manager of The Hill.
Thrilled to be here today with Kevin Self from Schneider Electric. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So American infrastructure is not just crumbling or outdated, it's really under assault like never before given climate change. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the United States must design and build differently as resilience and decarbonization get accelerated in this new policy environment.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And to your point, this is a once in a generation opportunity we have in front of us. Maybe you can go back to World War II and what was built then. But obviously the changes so many years later is a great opportunity for us to build something that's much more everlasting into the future. As you know, we've continued to kick this can down the road for multiple years, multiple decades. And it's absolutely critical that we get it right now. China's infrastructure spending has been 10 times ours. In many aspects, they're eating our lunch. And often infrastructure is thought of as concrete and steel. And we think a little bit differently than that at Schneider Electric. We actually think, as we think of infrastructure and building smart infrastructure, that electric and digital is the recipe for a more resilient and more sustainable world. Electric, because it makes energy green, and it's also the most efficient energy vector and the best one for decarbonization. Digital, because it makes the invisible visible. You can't measure what you don't know. And it also eliminates waste, and it also drives huge efficiencies. So as we think of the future, we think of one that's much more digital and much more electric. One proof point is we waste about 65% of all generated energy and 6 billion gallons of treated water a day. We only have to think back to a couple of weeks ago and still ongoing in Jackson, Mississippi. And the fact that there's infrastructure in the US in the year 2022 is not able to deliver for its citizens.
It sounds like when you mention digital, you're really talking about the transparency that brings more than any other benefit, right?
Yeah, I am. And it's interesting. I've heard a number of conversations as people talk about all this infrastructure money, and they harken back to 2008 and they talk about we were looking for shovel ready jobs. And then I've heard people talk about, well, not shovel ready, let's make it shovel worthy. We want to put another twist on it. And we want to talk about, make sure that it's digitally developed first, so that before we put shovel number one in the ground, we've looked at the digital twin of what we're building out, optimizing the system so that we're truly devising something that's going to last us for decades into the future. You know, it's interesting that all of us are walking around with these mini computers, cameras, phones in our pockets that has really digitized our personal lives. And we think there's a great opportunity to provide that into what we do during the day and how our infrastructure is developed going forward.
Well, with that in mind, let's talk about supply chain. Still certainly top of mind for businesses and consumers as we approach the holiday season, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it into next year. Besides the scrutiny on our ports and supply chain challenges, modernization goes right in line with that digital first mindset you're talking about. How's your team at Schneider approaching that, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, no, to your point, I think look at over time, over years and decades, we've optimized supply chains from a financial aspect, maybe not as much as from a resilience aspect. And we are very engaged in the redevelopment of supply chains across this country. We're actually doing work right now at the Port of Long Beach in California, which is the second busiest port in the US alongside the Port of Los Angeles. And we're working to convert all their cargo handling equipment to zero emissions technologies by 2030. So to bolster resilience, we deployed a microgrid to power key buildings and help achieve a zero emission operational footprint. The microgrid will produce 520 megawatt hours annually, reducing the port's reliance on diesel backup generators. And the microgrid allows the seaport, which handles $200 billion of cargo a year, to collect, forecast, and automatically optimize operations, while also driving greater safety. So we continue to see the electrification of ports as a critical opportunity and aspect of doing things differently into the future than we had in the past. So competing in the global economy requires resilient infrastructure, and microgrids are a great key component to make that work. It's also critical to think about those communities that live around the ports. We had a conversation with a local congresswoman, and what she wanted to talk about first on the Port of Long Beach wasn't what was happening in the port, but it's the fact that the air quality for the neighborhoods surrounding the port, which are low to moderate income, is much cleaner today than it was in the past. And so there's also benefits for the communities and the neighborhoods that surround all of this infrastructure.
Let's talk about manufacturing. I know the new Inflation Reduction Act is really focused on onshoring manufacturing and bringing more of those operations back domestically to the United States. How do you think policymakers and businesses should think about the next 2 to 3 years as we look to bring more of that back onshore?
I think we have a great opportunity to optimize the systems going forward. And it's interesting as people think about energy, I think we naturally think about the supply side first. And at Schneider Electric, we always focus demand side. You really can't develop your equilibrium equation until you balance supply and demand. And so taking the example of a glass manufacturer, your factory runs around the clock as it has been for 23 years, which happens to be the average age of U.S. manufacturing facility. And back then, right, everyone was on dial-up. And that's why you're still doing manual paperwork to track equipment data. Not only that, but your electric utility bills have been eating into your budget, now accounting for 35% of OPEX. But unless you have the visibility, you're unaware of this. And so your CEO is setting emission reduction targets and to cut your energy waste and increase operational efficiency, you have to find a way to modernize your facility. So how are you going to do it? We actually have a great example in Lexington, Kentucky. It's one of our facilities that is 60 plus years old. And a couple of years ago, it received designation as a lighthouse factory, one of the few in the world to receive this. And what we're able to do is make it smarter. We're able to reduce, we saw a 20% reduction in mean time to repair, 3.5% year over year energy savings, and a 5% reduction in downtime. Once again, it's making the invisible visible to ensure the great engineers that exist in this country, the data to understand how to optimize a system in front of them.
It's a powerful story of doing well by doing good. Great business outcomes from being mindful of some of these needs as well. Now, you brought up the recent events in Mississippi, but failure of water infrastructure just keeps making headlines, even going back to Flint a few years ago, and water shortages across the West. How has the federal government adapted since the first Flint headlines? And what does the future of water waste treatment look like? How does it protect and serve the public?
Yeah, talk about the best example of making the invisible visible. We're in the midst of a once in a generation federal investment in infrastructure, and obviously the bipartisan bill alone is going to be investing $54 billion into water and wastewater systems. And you brought up the Michigan examples, the other examples down south, what's happening in Jackson. You even look out west, where there's a lack of water at this point. So it's finally the point where we really need to be thinking about how we utilize this. And the federal investment's been urgently needed is we're also wasting 6 billion gallons of treated water a day. And an example we Schneider, are close partners with a company called Aviva. And they had an example of a couple of years ago where a small municipality in the southern part of the U.S. Thought that they had a natural spring under one of their residents' properties. And lo and behold, what was happening is every day they were losing 1/3 of their treated water. They thought it was a natural spring. It was their wasted water going down the pipes. They were about to spend $20 million on an investment that was unnecessary. And so once again, by bringing in the digital technologies and ensuring that we are devising and building things going forward where we have great visibility, we're able to make them smarter and make them much more long-lasting than they would be otherwise. There's other examples. The city of Phoenix, water reclamation facility serves 1.7 million customers, but the infrastructure is aged and decentralized. So city planners are looking to modernize the systems and create new installation programs for wastewater facilities. More examples across the country. We are very actively working to ensure, once again, that as we build things, we're building it looking forward over the next couple of decades versus building it as we might have in the 1990s or 2000s.
I'll really appreciate some of these examples of how Schneider Electric is helping lead the way and how data is helping us make those better than shovel-ready decisions about infrastructure investments in the United States. Once again, Kevin Self, SVP of Strategy, Business Development, and Government Relations for Schneider Electric. Thank you again for taking time with us today.
And thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Jason and Kevin Self, Senior Vice President, Strategy, Business Development, and Government Relations at Schneider Electric. The infrastructure bill allocated $22 billion to Amtrak for some much overdue repairs. I sat down with Stephen Gardner, Amtrak's CEO, before Amtrak began canceling trains ahead of a possible rail strike. Stephen Gardner, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Bob.
Let me ask you the obvious question. What was the pandemic like for Amtrak and for you personally? You know, I talked to a fair amount of members of Congress in the spring of 2020 who were getting briefings, and they thought, well, it would maybe last a few weeks or a couple of months, and we're still in it. How has that affected Amtrak?
Well, Bob, it was an incredible disruption to our business, as it was to everyone. And at Amtrak, we saw essentially 100,000 riders a day sort of disappear over the course of a month. We went from about 100,000 down to about 3,000 daily riders. So it was really an unparalleled impact to our business. And of course, it made sense at the time. We were in lockdown, everyone rightfully very concerned. But it was a huge change at the company and required us to radically downsize our operation, develop new procedures as we all tried to understand the safe way to navigate this pandemic and ensure both our employees and customers were safe, those who had to travel. So it was a huge disruption. I'm really glad to say that through that, we did do, I think, a good job at maintaining that safety and building confidence for riders so that now ridership is really coming back. We see strong demand again. We had a lot of new people come and try Amtrak and rail for the first time, maybe because they were not interested in flying or looking for a new travel option. And we hope to keep those passengers and build back to the levels we were before the pandemic and beyond.
Congress did come together. Bipartisanship is rare nowadays, but they did come together to pass the infrastructure bill. I believe that has $22 billion for Amtrak. How are you going to spend that money and over what timeline?
Yeah, great question. And you're right. We see just strong bipartisan support everywhere across America for passenger rail investment. And that really, I think, was in clear effect here with the administration and Congress's work with the bipartisan infrastructure law. That bill does provide $22 billion directly to Amtrak over the next 5 years. And that funding is really for us to bring our system today and all of the assets and technology and infrastructure into the 21st century. Amtrak inherited a collection of rolling stock. Those are passenger cars, locomotives, and infrastructure, bridges and tunnels, many built in the 1900s, early 1900s, some in the 1800s. And we've been working hard to bring those into modern standards, but this is the funding we need to take those old assets and have a whole new fleet of equipment and upgraded infrastructure to support our network and grow ridership.
As far as the process of how Amtrak decides where to spend that money, upgrading, obviously, along the Northeast corridor, there are some repairs that are needed, or will it be, across the country? And how do those decisions get made?
Yeah, great question. There's really 4 big areas of investment, and those are occurring nationwide. Our big infrastructure needs, those are our bridges, tunnels, tracks. Those are primarily in the Northeast corridor. That's where Amtrak owns the railroad. Most of our trains operate over the freight railroad network where we're a tenant. But in the Northeast, we own the big portion of the Northeast corridor. So we've got a lot of infrastructure responsibilities there. Then we have this fleet that I mentioned, our passenger cars and locomotives. We've already started the process of upgrading that fleet, but this new money provides us the ability to complete that process in total. And that's going to be for our entire nationwide fleet. So the trains that we use for those long distance routes connecting the regions, for our state supported or corridor services going from city to city. So over the course of this next decade, we will place the orders and start receiving new equipment for the entire network. So everyone across the nation will see the benefit of that investment. And then we have our stations, many of which are not either in a state of good repair up to modern standards, and many of which are not yet accessible to all passengers. So we will be making big investments there to bring those stations up to standard. And finally, we've got a lot of core technology needs. Again, as the digital technology revolution makes everything more accessible and brings new capabilities and innovation and efficiency, we're going to upgrade our systems so we can provide better service to people all over America.
You're a former Capitol Hill staff. You've been at Amtrak a long time, been in this field a long time. Big picture, if you look at other countries, including China, who are ahead of us, what is the future of rail? Where do we need to go? I would imagine that you're very thankful for this investment, but you're going to need more investment down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an incredible investment. It's more money, or sort of roughly equivalent to all of the federal investment in Amtrak over 50 years, is now being provided to the company and to the Department of Transportation Secretary Buttigieg, who's a fantastic leader on rail issues. They've got a big portion of funding to help support improvement and expansion of the network as well. So combined, that's about the same amount that Amtrak has received over 50 years. So it's a huge change, and it really does enable us to start to fulfill what we think is our core mission, which is to provide valuable options to American travelers, a sustainable path of mobility that has a lower greenhouse gas emissions profile and really provides economic opportunity for communities around the nation. We are going to need more resources than this. This is a great down payment that gets us started, primarily first in replacing all those old assets, but then through the money that's available through the Secretary and the Department of Transportation's leadership, starting to put more trains in more communities where today Amtrak may serve once a day or maybe not serve at all. We think passenger rail has a big role to play. If we're going to address climate change, we've got to have more sustainable means of transportation. And the big difference between Asia and Europe and America is the investment. That past 20 years, Europe has invested about $1 trillion in their passenger rail system. We're here really excited about this investment of about $60 billion between Amtrak and the Department of Transportation, but it's really just the beginning, and we see so much more opportunity for passenger rail. We have the largest rail network in the world of any nation, something that we often don't talk about much here. What we need to do is use more of it for moving passengers, as well as freight. We need to see both parts of this industry grow, and we're confident that can happen.
How confident are you that outside of the so-called Acela corridor, that putting more trains and this type of transportation in other parts of the country can be profitable?
Well, I think that the key sort of point here is, where can passenger rail create value? And I think there are places all over the United States where that's true. We measure our value by not only the kind of bottom line of revenue and expense, but also the value we bring to communities in terms of mobility and job creation and opportunities. And where we've seen places all over the United States that have not had lots of rail service in the past, and we've introduced new service, we see strong demand where we can have a reliable, frequent, and trip time competitive with driving service. People choose to take the train. And I think part of that is because it's just so much more productive than driving. Today, everybody's on their phones. They want to be doing work and experiencing digital technology all the time. It's difficult to do that in your car. On the train, you've got that capability. And we see really strong preference, particularly amongst the younger generations, for rail travel. So what we've got to do is put trains in the right spots where the markets, I think, support them. But there are lots of places. Think about in Texas or Atlanta or places in the Mountain West like the Front Range, Tucson to Phoenix. These are corridors which we have either no or very little service today, but have huge population and a lot of demand, we think, for service like this. Where we've done it in the Midwest and the Northeast and the California and Pacific Northwest, people have responded. We think that's going to be true in these other corridors as well.
Stephen, in many industries, including in journalism, there's a labor shortage here. How have you dealt with that, and going forward with all this expansion and spending money? How are you going to handle also an aging population, more people retiring? How will you deal with that and acquiring talent?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's on the minds of, I think, every organization right now. We have a really robust hiring plan. We've already hired over 2,000 folks this fiscal year alone. We've got 50 hiring events scheduled for next year. We've got about 4,000 vacancies we're trying to fill. And that's in part to bring back the service levels we had before the pandemic, and then to create that capacity we need to do a lot more building and new service. I will say we're getting a lot of great excitement from folks. I think people are excited about the possibility of rail and Amtrak, and that's good, but it takes a long time to train and qualify the employees we need because this is specialized technical work. So that's really our big challenge, is we've got to get folks through the training process. But we're building a whole new capability. For a long time, Amtrak was replacing employees as they retired, but wasn't really in a growth mode. And now we are in that mode, and it takes a different mindset. I will say there is excitement across the country in having an opportunity to be part of this passenger rail revolution. So we're taking advantage of that and looking for employees everywhere we can.
Last question, with all this money coming into Amtrak and being used for new initiatives, but also repairing issues along the Acela corridor. I think everyone wants to know. I want to know. I'm from New York. I take Amtrak all the time. Will this affect, repairing? Will this affect trains now? Because I'm sure some people are thinking, oh, there's going to be delays because they got to fix X, Y, and Z. And you do have to fix a fair amount of things. How will you deal with that?
Well, it's a good question, and it is going to be a challenge. We've got to repair and rebuild assets up and down the Northeast corridor that are in some cases something like our Baltimore Potomac Tunnel is from 1860s. So we will be working hard to both achieve that work and provide great levels of service at good reliability. And the benefits of these projects as they come online, they will be reducing some trip time in cases, will certainly be increasing reliability. So there will be benefits, but just like you see in the highways and the airports, when you're under construction, it does cause some disruption, but we're going to be working with all of our partners to try and maintain the service levels we can and create a lot of new tools for our passengers so they can understand exactly what our service is, how our trains are performing in terms of on-time performance, and put more control in their hands about adjustments for schedule. But we're going to be working hard. Our goal is to both rebuild the railway for the future and also grow service. You'll see that with our new Acela trains as they come online, and then the new regional fleet that comes mid-decade that we've already placed the order for. These are going to be a big upgrade in terms of performance and give us more capacity to serve more folks. So maybe we'll have bigger trains, can carry more people, and that will help us while we also have to do some of this big repair work on our tracks.
On the Acela timeline, as far as those new trains, when any idea of when that they'll come
next
online?
Year? Yep, 2023. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, Stephen Gardner, heading Amtrak at a pivotal time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Bob.
I'm now joined by Dorval Carter, president of the Chicago Transit Authority, who is one of the pioneers to sign the Infrastructure Equity Pledge, which vows to grant contracting opportunities to historically underutilized businesses. We spoke a short time ago. Dorval Carter, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I first wanted to ask you, what have you learned from the pandemic? It's obviously disrupted the nation, the world. What did it mean for your job in Chicago?
Well, I think for me and just about any other transit system, the pandemic was literally a game changer for the way that we do business. In my particular case, we had an 80% drop in our ridership in a matter of a couple of days, along with the corresponding revenue. So we went into crisis management mode almost immediately. And as I've told people in the past, there was no playbook for how to deal with a pandemic in public transit. And so we were literally sort of building a plane as we were flying it. From a leadership standpoint, it was probably the biggest leadership challenge that I've ever taken on. And from an agency standpoint, our primary focus was on how to continue to deliver service and how to protect our employees from the impact of this virus that was literally ravaging throughout the country.
And what about ridership and how you got through it? Has it returned? And are you optimistic that in the future? Obviously, we now have vaccines, but still people are getting COVID.
Yeah, it's been an interesting progression. Before the pandemic, CTA was carrying about 1.4 million people a day. At the height of the shutdown, our ridership had dropped to a little bit under 200,000 a day. Which I would point out was still a lot of people. Since that time, our ridership has grown to a little bit over 600,000 a day, and so we have seen a steady progression, an increase in our ridership, and so we're optimistic that ridership will continue to grow. But we are obviously watching very closely in terms of what the final sort of ceiling is going to be, particularly given all the other changes that have happened in general with regards to people returning to work and working from home and the other things we're seeing affect mobility in a city like Chicago.
Whether it's at the federal or state level, whether it's infrastructure or other industries, as you know, a lot of times it's who you know as far as getting contracts and that kind of thing. But you were instrumental in signing an equity pledge. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why did you sign that equity pledge? And what are the barriers facing minority-owned businesses?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I signed it is that I thought the equity and infrastructure project really represented something that I've been focused on over my almost 40 years worth of service in this industry. We have always viewed our responsibility here at CTA as more than just moving people. It's about serving communities and really connecting and leveraging the federal and state dollars that we get to help support the communities that we serve. So the equity and infrastructure project really was a parallel to something that I believed in strongly and was quite honestly honored to be asked to be one of the leading founders of that movement, to really take advantage of a historic level of funding that has been provided to us by the federal government and using it in a way that actually opens up access to and helps, as you pointed out, reduce the barriers that have significantly impacted how minority and disadvantaged businesses have been able to access these types of funds and projects in the past.
As far as transportation, as you know, we're in very polarizing times. It used to be healthcare and taxes, always a kind of a partisan battle, no matter what the decade. Education and definitely transportation was more bipartisan. And getting the transportation bill to President Biden's desk was very difficult. It was a bipartisan bill, but it wasn't easy. I was skeptical it was going to happen, but it did. What does that now law mean for CTA? And are you optimistic that the parties are going to be able to build upon that success?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Having worked at the federal level in the Obama administration, and over the course of my career, historically, transportation has been a bipartisan issue. Building bridges, buying trains, improving infrastructure is something that benefits both blue and red constituents alike. And I think that we did have our challenges with this particular infrastructure bill, not so much because of, I think, the underlying principles of improving the country's infrastructure, but I think because of the size of the bill that was ultimately passed and for which we're extremely grateful. For an agency like CTA, we're probably going to see probably about an extra $600 million in just the formula funding that will come to this city as a result of the infrastructure bill itself, which is a significant increase in funding. And that doesn't include our ability to access many of the discretionary programs that are also a part of the bill that will just add to that total. So from my perspective, this is a game changer type of piece of legislation. Agencies like mine, particularly older transit systems, have a huge backlog of unmet capital needs just to get to a state of good repair. And this will significantly impact that backlog in a positive way. It will allow the city of Chicago and the Chicago Transit Authority to really move a large number of projects that will benefit a lot of the communities here that deserve better more efficient and improved transit services.
As far as the battle on climate change, we've seen both with the transportation bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, we've seen a piece of legislation that have become law that attack climate change. How do you think, what are the solutions? Electric vehicles, mass transit? Do you see us getting on a path where we're getting in our gas powered cars less?
Well, I think the first solution is properly funding and supporting public transportation. Regardless of whether we're operating zero emission buses like electric buses or low emission diesel buses, that's still a better alternative than the single occupancy vehicle. It will still reduce congestion, it will still improve the climate, and it will still provide for a better quality of living in the communities that we serve. I don't know that there's any real right answer to your question from a transit standpoint. Clearly, supporting transit does have a environmental benefit to the cities that we operate in, as well as the rural areas that the industry operates in. But it's not cheap. And really, the never-ending conversation around public transportation is both the cost of maintaining it, and then ultimately the issue around fares. How much should people pay for it? Ideally, in a utopia world, you could offer free public transit to anyone who would need it. Realistically, we have to pay the bills, and so that requires us to pay, to charge fares and to ultimately impact, sometimes in a negative way, those who can least afford it, because of the lack of funding that we have to support the operations of an agency of our size.
We've seen in recent polls there was concern about COVID as a top issue, but that has slipped now, and it's more inflation and gas prices. But among the top issues is also crime. What is the CTA doing to combat crime, and what do you think are the keys to making sure that riders feel safe?
Well, there's no question that if I want to get my ridership back, I have to make sure that they feel safe on our system. And I think it's really important to point out that public transit agencies don't operate in a vacuum. We are reflective of the communities that we serve. And to the extent that there are crime issues in a broader sense in any major metropolitan area, you're going to see that reflected on the public transit system itself. What we do and what we believe is important is to create a perception of safety for our customers. And what that means is having high visibility through police, the police themselves, through security guards, through other tools that we have, including increased lighting, infrastructure investments around cameras and monitors and other things that allow us to do the best that we can to mitigate the potential situation of crime occurring on a public transit system. At CTA, crime is relatively low compared to what you may see in normal urban environments. However, having said that, one crime is one too many, and obviously to the person who has been a victim of that crime, it is a very serious issue. And we have to show the public that we are both committed to addressing those issues and are dedicated to supporting the efforts that are necessary to reduce crime on public transit.
Last question, I want to get to tap into your expertise both at the local and the federal level. As you mentioned, you worked in the Obama administration and you've worked at the local level, obviously. Some people just work at the local level or they work in Washington. What is the value of having both experiences?
Well, understanding both the practical realities of what it means to have the funding necessary to make a difference in people's lives, it's certainly what I gain at the local level, where I'm boots on the ground. I'm seeing the impact of public transit every day. Being able to tie that together with the policies that ultimately support that effort, which is what I did at the federal level, I think has really given me a unique and broad experience in that not only do I know what kind of policies are most effective, but I also understand how the funding works and where the funding opportunities are for an agency like mine. And so to me, it's the opportunity to have the best of both worlds, both seeing the big picture while also understanding at the micro level what that big picture represents. And I think ultimately that gets you the best opportunity to provide the best service that we can for the city of Chicago.
That makes sense. Dorval Carter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We've been talking about transportation throughout today, and we've interviewed a number of people, whether it's Mitch Landrieu at the White House, mayors, as well as the head of Amtrak. And it is one of the most important issues and one of the most divisive issues in this Congress. Even though the bipartisan infrastructure bill did pass, it passed with minimal Republican support. And at one point, that was tied to what, at that point, was the Build Back Better. And we thought we were going to get kind of a dual deal, and Congress was going to pass them both. But that didn't work out. The infrastructure bill passed, but the Build Back Better did not. And we will be talking about that with our next guest. And our next guest has spent his 36-year congressional career devoted to transportation and environment issues, and is retiring this year. Congressman Peter DeFazio, the chairman of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Bill, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, Congressman, as far as I want to get to the news of the week, is the rail worker strike that is pending come Friday. Should, some people say Congress should get involved because this is going to have, if it does happen, going to have such economic consequences. What do you think?
Well, Bob, look, I've been talking to the White House pretty regularly. They are fully engaged. They're engaged with both sides in the dispute. And, we're doing everything we can to avert, a final confrontation on, at midnight tomorrow night. And I think it's entirely possible we get a negotiated settlement. The unions are the two major unions are asking for something that is extraordinary to me that freight rail, who is immensely profitable, will not provide, which is 5 unpaid sick days. They started out asking for 5 paid sick days. Now they're just saying 5 unpaid sick days. So I can go to the doctor and not get penalized. They have point systems at BNSF now. In a certain number of points, you're fired. You go to the doctor 4 times, you're fired. When they deem it to be a critical time for the freight industry. So I think that's something the railroads could certainly afford. In fact, it doesn't cost them anything.
I wanted to talk about your op-ed that ran in The Hill, and thank you for writing that. And basically, you make the case that we had the most productive Congress since the Eisenhower era. Tell me why.
Well, the IIJA. Now, I'll grant at the beginning, it doesn't have all the policies I wanted to deal with climate and fossil fuel reduction, but it does have the most significant measures ever passed and augmented by what's in the IRA later, the in Reinvestment Act on climate. There's a total of $44 billion in the bill dealing with climate and resilience. The administration is attempting to even go a bit further. They're trying, through guidance, to have states do what was in my bill, which is fix it first. Before you go out and build a whole bunch of new lane miles, first repair what you have. Repair the 400,000 bridges on the national highway system that need work. Repair the 40% of the national highway system that's deteriorated so much you have to rebed it and resurface it. And then, of course, the $100 billion backlog in transit. And then also fix it first was, well, look at alternatives. Is there a better way to move people than to keep infinitely trying to expand highways? Because a lot of places you can't do that anymore, and it's not necessarily the best way to get it done. So they're doing that in guidance. They're also conditioning some of the grants on climate issues. So it's going to be big on climate. It's huge on infrastructure. This is the largest investment in infrastructure in the history of the United States of America. Over $600 billion, and it's sorely needed. We're C- with the scoring by the American Society of Civil Engineers. We've dropped back from being the leader in the world to being essentially a laughingstock of the world in the deterioration of our system and the inefficiencies in our system. And this bill is going to do a lot to address that. So I think that's absolutely huge.
I wanted to ask, we have some questions from the audience. One question comes from Tina Wojnar, a program manager, Water and Waste Water Equipment Manufacturers Association. And her question is, will Buy America requirements from the bipartisan now law delay projects or raise project budget costs?
First off, if there are, particular components that are not available, waivers can be granted. But we want to encourage, and the president wants to encourage, U.S. manufacturing. And we have found that actually, in many cases where people want to buy cheaper foreign materials, there are U.S. materials available. And yeah, maybe at a slightly higher cost, but guess what? Those people get paid a good wage in America, and they boost the economy. So, I've never been a free trader, so-called free trader, and I think we learned the folly of that during the pandemic. We can't even make N95 masks anymore, dependent upon the Chinese for all sorts of critical things. No, that's not where we want to be in the future.
You've been in the transportation world for so long, and you're retiring. You're not running for another term. How has transportation become more partisan over the years? It's a question I asked Congressman Graves earlier.
Well, we do a lot of things that aren't partisan. We passed the Water Resources Development Act, the largest ever out of the committee, total with I think three Republicans, three of the ultra right wing, whatever they are, voted against it, but all the other Republicans voted for it. Passed the House with a huge margin, again, bipartisan. Coast Guard, again, I think that may have been unanimous. There may have been a few, again, of these Republicans who won't vote for any bill. So, that's another major bill we have pending, the Water Resources Development Bill. When it came to transportation, they said that climate didn't belong in a transportation bill. And they opposed, the bill I proposed in the House. And then, of course, the Senate bill, really pulled back on the climate issues. But they still, all but 12 of them voted against it, which is pathetic because Trump said it was horrible. It wasn't any good. This is the guy who told us he was going to put $2 billion in. He said it was too much money. Well, this isn't, $2 trillion.
$2 trillion. Right.
Yep. $2 trillion, right. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's just sour grapes on his part. And of course, they're all afraid of him. So all but 12 House Republicans voted against rebuilding our deteriorated infrastructure, including wastewater and drinking water. That was pathetic.
Congressman, you've always spoke your mind, and I remember we interviewed you after the stimulus was passed in the Obama administration. You voted against it. The former president wasn't really happy with that. I just what are your reflections on your career, and what do you plan to do now that you're retiring from Capitol Hill?
Well, the last big thing I wanted to get done, and I started under Obama, was a major increase in investment in surface transportation. I was proposing $350 billion increase. We had $600 billion. So even though it's not all the policies I wanted, that was kind of the last big thing. Last Congress, I got finally, after 25 years, starting with Bud Huster, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund created. That's another $1 billion a year to deal with the critical needs of our harbors in terms of shoaling and in terms of deteriorating breakwaters, in terms of modernizing our ports for larger ships. So, I feel really good about the things that I've gotten done over the years. And I just didn't have any major objectives in my committee looming in front of me. Another FAA bill. Hey, the FAA hasn't implemented some of the most critical reforms in my last FAA bill. I'm still fighting with them over that. Flight attendant duty time, secondary barriers. I just felt that it was a logical time. My district got better. I've got a great candidate running. So I believe a Democrat can hold it. She wants to be on Transportation Infrastructure Committee and continue the legacy.
Sam Graves earlier was expressing cautious optimism that the House will flip. You're one of 31 retirements in the House. Do you think that Democrats can defy the odds and keep control of the lower chamber?
Well, things have changed pretty dramatically in the last 6 months. 6 months ago, they were writing the House off. Now we find people who were underwater in their polling for re-election on the issue particularly of choice And then the accomplishments this summer, are suddenly finding that, when they emphasize those things, they're up in the polls. So if I were the Republicans, I wouldn't run around measuring the drapes yet. It's not going to be a normal midterm presidential year. It's not going to be like Obama, where we took a shellacking. And we took it because he did not, the Recovery Act was not oriented toward putting people back to work and building infrastructure, even though he went around leaning on shovels a lot. So that's why I voted against it. It could have been a bill that would put a hell of a lot of people. In fact, John Mica, who took over when the Republicans took over, said, if you had prevailed in that debate and you guys had actually done a lot of infrastructure, you probably would be sitting in this chair.
As far as just last question on, do you think that the administration is doing a good job of implementing the new transportation law?
Well, yeah, they're rolling out things very quickly. We've got Landrieu. DOT in most of the categories there, first off, the states get their 40% increase in their level of funding automatically. So they know that money's there. And then there are a whole bunch of new programs that the administration has been rolling out quickly. Grants are being rendered. They're working now on the last biggest piece, the mega grants, and they're doing well there. Now, we were a little slower over in rail because we have never made major investments in rail before, particularly in Amtrak. So they're gearing up over there to get that done. But that will happen.
It was quite an accomplishment getting that bill. I know it was ugly there. Sausage making and legislating can be ugly, but you got it done. Congressman Peter DeFazio, the chairman of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, thanks for joining us, and hope you have a great retirement.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
My next guest is Eric Hooks, FEMA's deputy administrator. I sat down with him not too long ago. Have a listen. Eric Hooks, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
I wanted to ask you first question. The Biden administration recently announced a $3 billion initiative on climate resiliency. Can you tell us a little bit about that effort?
Yes, Bob. As our nation faces more frequent and severe disasters, our agency is acknowledging the impact of climate change. And we're very grateful that under President Biden's leadership, along with great partnership from the Congress, that FEMA and the entire executive branch is taking a whole of government approach to tackling the issue of climate change head on. Specifically, we just recently announced the additional funding for our annual resilience grants programs that traditionally have been around $700 million to more than $3 billion for fiscal year 2022.
And can you give us an idea of how this will be spread out and how it will affect vulnerable communities as far as the funding is concerned?
Yes. Let me begin by saying that, the impacts of climate change leading to more persistent disasters and stronger impact from disasters don't discriminate, but a number of vulnerable communities recover less well. So we will be targeting opportunities to provide funding to those communities. Specifically, there are two grant programs that I'll discuss with $3 billion. The funding level for BRIC, which we call it, which is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, is a program which funds projects that protect people and infrastructure from natural hazards and the effects of climate change. And again, that amount of money has doubled. We also have our flood mitigation assistance, which those projects will mitigate against flood risk facing homes and communities. And that money has dramatically increased as well.
We've seen this year, some massive weather shifts. We've seen fires, record drought. What is your advice to local communities across the country? And so many of them are facing climate change challenges. What's your overall advice to them, both short term and long term?
Sure. I have the experience of coming from a state who has suffered an inordinate amount of disasters within the last few years prior to coming to FEMA. So my advice to all of those states is that Whereas states and the federal government has really done well in response mode, we all really need to pivot toward mitigation. The smart investment of funds in mitigation on the front end can reduce pain and suffering and save lives on the back end. Overall, we talked about the $3 billion that was recently announced, but really the landmark legislation from the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was championed by President Biden and thankfully agreed upon by Congress, will allow FEMA to invest in community-wide mitigation to reduce disaster suffering. So we want to invest in projects that make the infrastructure stronger, that makes the communities more resilient to those storms that will surely come.
With the infrastructure bill, you mentioned it was bipartisan, a big legislative victory for President Biden. As far as, is this one of the biggest investments that you've seen in combating climate change?
Absolutely, and not only is it a victory for President Biden, it's a victory for all involved. It's a victory for the entire country, particularly those communities that have been dramatically impacted by flooding and other such natural hazards over the last few years. And so it's really a game changer in my point of view, that we can invest in communities, we can provide for a more resilient infrastructure so that ultimately we can have a more resilient nation.
What can stakeholders do? I know you're working with a lot of people at the local level, but affiliated groups and stakeholders, what have you seen at the local level when everything, either it's responding to an emergency and the effort goes well? What is going on when there's that success after some type of rough condition or disaster?
Well, I've seen it personally in my own career. I previously served in North Carolina, and I reflect back to Hurricane Florence, how when the community comes together, both government and the private sector and faith-based organizations can all pull together, that you can save and sustain lives and really help your communities get back to a sense of normalcy more quickly. And as we look at the opportunities that smart strategic investments can make in those communities that have suffered from disastrous and repetitive flooding through the years, it's a great opportunity for us to invest in communities, to improve the local economy, and to make those communities more resilient into the long term.
Looking at the long term, where do you want to see policymakers and investments so that in 5 to 10 years things are getting better, or at least we're dealing with a problem that's getting worse, and it's not getting, when can we kind of turn the corner? What do we have to do that?
Well, I think that the jury kind of is still out for that. But what I can say that there has been plenty of research to indicate that, from the government standpoint, that an investment of $1 in mitigation can save us $6 of disaster cost on the back end. And when we factor in strong building codes, that $1 investment can save us $11 on the back end. So it's strategically sound investments that we need to take to combat the threats of the hazards that we face all across the country. We're seeing, as you mentioned early on, increased flooding, wildfires, all types of manners of natural hazards. And so that's why I'm especially pleased to lift up the funding that has been provided under the leadership of the administration and the concurrence of Congress. And also, while we are in National Preparedness Month, lift up the idea that in order to be a prepared nation, we need to be prepared at the local individual level. And that extends all the way up to the federal government. And the federal government, in particular FEMA, is there for those communities as they try to build more resilient.
Eric, can you give us an idea of, when we're writing about legislation and it passes, a lot of people think that's the end of the story, but really that's the beginning of the story as far as implementation. How does it work in the government? On climate change, there's so many different departments that have some type of responsibility on climate change. How does that work? And I would imagine as this massive bill is being implemented more, there's got to be a lot of interagency communication and coordination.
Absolutely. As far as the bill process, oftentimes you may have an authorization, but you may have to come back later to get the actual dollars that are appropriated to fund those programs. And we see that in a number of pieces of legislation that move through the Congress and ultimately signed by the president. This administration has been decisively engaged with having all of the departments come together as we talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law, at this point, so that we can talk about the various things that we're doing as individual agencies so that we can gain synergies into helping build more resilient communities, because it is tremendously helpful for FEMA to know what DOT and EPA and the Interior, what investments they're able to make in communities as we complement those communities with disaster programs into the future.
Well, when you look at the climate change provisions in this new infrastructure law, what amount of time? When do you think we will see? Because, as we've talked about, it takes a while to implement some of the more complicated language in it, to dole out the money. When do you think that people will see, okay, we are making progress? Is it a year? Is it 2? Is it a 5-year program?
I think all of the above. I think that there are some immediate wins that you will see as projects from the year previous start coming to fruition. The administrator and I have been across the country and have viewed several projects that have taken form, but recovery never comes quick enough for communities. And sometimes these projects will take a number of years. And so there's the whole process of appropriations that has to take place. And then there's the actual development of the programs within the federal government. And as we work with our state, local, and tribal partners to make sure that there's a great understanding of how these programs would be rolled out. The programs that I've mentioned to you, they're by and large competitive programs. So those state, local, tribal territories would have to apply for those grants. There are some that are set aside for our tribal nation partners, but they have to compete for projects that are viable, projects that fit within the legislative intent of the Congress. And we're trying every day to look for ways to streamline that process, but recovery and the building of a more resilient community does take a while.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but Eric Hooks, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your knowledge on this very important topic.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you today.
My final guest was recently named Maryland's infrastructure director by Governor Larry Hogan, tasked with coordinating Maryland's pursuit of federal infrastructure funds and evaluating projects. Welcome, Allison Mayer.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be with you this afternoon to talk about this very important topic. Certainly states are on the front lines implementing all of the programs that are in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I have to say, it's a pretty dynamic time to be on the front lines, delivering these big projects and big infrastructure.
Absolutely. Allison, what does the infrastructure law mean for Maryland? And what do you think it's going to do for the state?
So our current estimate for the amount of funding that's coming to the state of Maryland over the next 5 years is just under $7.8 billion. And that's across the spectrum, going toward things like highway infrastructure, transit, water and wastewater treatment facilities, broadband, as well as cybersecurity and resiliency activities. So it's really going to cut across all segments of our infrastructure and hopefully address some state of good repair backlog needs and maintaining the infrastructure we have, accelerating projects already in our pipeline, and delivering new infrastructure that's needed to address things like congestion and getting folks connected that haven't been able to get high-speed internet.
The White House holds weekly calls with state coordinators. Can you kind of bring us behind the scenes a little bit, what those calls are about and how they basically coordinate the implementation of the infrastructure law?
Sure. So back in, I guess it was January, Mitch Landrieu sent out a letter to all 50 governors asking them to appoint an infrastructure coordinator at the state level. And the preference was try to bring in somebody within the governor's office that already knows how to navigate state governments, work with the different agencies and cabinet members to really work together and get things done. So with that list, all 50 states have named someone like myself, and the White House brings us together very frequently. In fact, back in May, invited everybody in person to attend a roundtable at the White House, which was pretty cool. But really those calls are all about, what resources we need at the state level, what information we need at the state level to best guide decision-making, to make sure that this investment really is making the best impact it possibly can at the state level.
This is a question I asked the Phoenix mayor earlier. How does Maryland prioritize on transportation infrastructure? What needs to be done today? What needs to be done tomorrow? And what can wait maybe a month or a year, or a couple of years?
Sure. So most of this funding that's coming into our state is really a continuation of an reauthorization of programs that we're very accustomed to administering in Maryland. And I have to say, our process to develop long-range planning is a very collaborative one, where we work hand in glove with all 23 jurisdictions across our state, counties and cities to develop their priority lists. We want our priorities reflected as their priorities and vice versa. So it's a very collaborative process where they identify their most needed projects, and we work with them to ensure that, to the best of our ability, we're able to get those into our 6-year plan. That draft was just released back a couple weeks ago. And in fact, our transportation secretary and officials take a tour of the whole state, meet with everyone at the local level, get their feedback, and where needed, they make tweaks. So the latest 6-year plan for Maryland is $19.9 billion. A lot of that is some of this IIJA funding. So it's very exciting that we're able to, get their feedback and implement their priorities.
When you're implementing a transportation law, you obviously need people who can do it. Has that been a problem in Maryland, because we have a looming rail worker strike, and we've had labor shortages? How is Maryland dealing with that issue?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the rail strike issue with a couple of your previous guests. We're watching that very closely here in Maryland, because it impacts not only from a supply chain standpoint, but also our commuter rail service utilizes CSX lines. So a potential strike would potentially sideline our ability to get commuters to and from their workplace. So we're definitely watching that issue closely. This overall environment that we're working in now to implement the infrastructure bill, it's been likened to a perfect storm. A colleague of mine in the industry mentioned that earlier this week, that given the inflationary environment that we're in, workforce constraints, because these are positions typically, you have to report to a work site. There's not a telework option to work in this construction industry. And then increasingly complex federal processes and policy objectives that we're navigating kind of all leads to this perfect storm. But certainly we hear from industry day in and day out that workforce needs are a big challenge.
Allison, as you know, there was a heated debate on the transportation bill, now law. Used to be on big transportation bills, there was a lot of bipartisanship in Congress, and it was a running joke in Washington and beyond that this is Transportation Week in the Trump administration. They really never got anything going, even though Trump wanted to spend perhaps up to $2 trillion at one point. In Maryland, is it more of a bipartisan issue with the state legislature?
So what I would say is, with governors, and certainly with my governor, he's a Republican in a very blue state. So we certainly try to bring bipartisan solutions to get things done at the state level. I will say Governor Hogan did play, I think, a pretty large role in championing a lot of the concepts that ultimately came into the bipartisan infrastructure law, going back in time to 2019 when he chaired the National Governors Association and used infrastructure as his chairman's initiative. A lot of the concepts between, including cybersecurity, resiliency to ward off against climate change impacts, as well as flooding, as well as addressing our crumbling roads and bridges, were all part of that initiative. So, we approach things in Maryland maybe a little bit differently, because we do have a Democratic-controlled state legislature and then a Republican-controlled administration at the executive level.
I was interviewing Chairman DeFazio earlier, and he has written this op-ed highlighting what Democrats have done. But as far as this transportation bill and now law, When are Maryland residents going to feel, wow, you know, my bridge is getting better? I'm interested when I drive in Maryland a lot. Oh, traffic is better. You know, but you want to both pass the law and also tout it to say we're making progress. But this is a long-term type of deal, right?
Most of these projects are long-term. I'll echo what Congressman Graves mentioned earlier, that you know, we do want to express gratitude that the one federal decision, some of that was codified within this, because, you know, when you're at the state level, having that certainty around the permitting process is really, really important, because getting a project permitted is a multi-year process. So you have to get that done before shovels even get into the ground. So, you know, I think what our residents will see is that, you know, projects that we've already got in the pipeline, we're going to keep accelerating those. I think a good example of the kinds of new projects we're able to speed up is something like the Maryland 90 bridges. That's one of the key ways to get in and out of Ocean City. So thinking about it from just a congestion standpoint, but also from a hurricane and tropical storm preparedness standpoint, you know, we need to think about replacing a two-lane bridge that a lot of people would be transiting in the effect of a hurricane coming.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to thank Allison Mayer, Maryland's Infrastructure Director, for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to Schneider Electric and the Project Management Institute for their support, and to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For those of you who may have missed any of these conversations, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Be well.